Joe Biden promises that he can heal America, but there are good reasons to think that he's wrong. A vaccine is on the way that has 90% effectiveness against COVID-19, and climate scientists stand up against end-of-the-world doomerism, even as President Trump gives them a final kick on his way out the door. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. The different realities of US politics couldn't have been more starkly drawn than we've seen this week. On the one hand, the US media projected that Joe Biden had enough votes in the bag to be crowned as the president-elect, and the rest of the world mostly accepted this, with world leaders giving him their congratulations and queuing up to be the first to have their phone calls returned. On the other hand, since the vote counting process is being powered by a team of heavily drugged one-legged tortoises, it isn't completed yet, so technically the election isn't over. That said, there are indications that the Trump team is starting to come to terms with a growing realisation that the evidence they may have of voter fraud wouldn't be sufficient, even if it was all successful in the courts, to actually overturn the result. If true, that will be a relief to the media, since they decided not to give claims of fraud any credence at all by discussing it seriously as even a long-shot possibility. Indeed, several times the news channels, including Fox News by the way, cut away from interviews or press events when they started talking about evidence of fraud. So they weren't just content to disagree with what had been said, which of course they're entitled to do, they actually wanted to actively prevent you from seeing it. That's extraordinary and exactly symbolic of why this next part isn't going to work at all. The next part being that Biden made his victory speech, and he made it clear that this victory meant that it was time for America to heal. This is what he had to say.
Who voted for President Trump? I understand the disappointment tonight. I've lost a couple times myself, but now let's give each other a chance. It's time to put away the harsh rhetoric, lower the temperature, see each other again, listen to each other again. And to make progress, we have to stop treating our opponents as our enemies. They are not our enemies, they are Americans. They're Americans. The Bible tells us to everything there is a season, a time to build, a time to reap and a time to sow, and a time to heal. This is the time to heal in America.
Now that got reported largely in glowing terms. After all, it would be genuinely a good thing if America was actually able to heal. But people are mistaken if they think that the inclusion of that sentiment in that speech was really a reaching out to all those Trump supporters. This is politics, and this isn't a criticism, just reality. Of course, there is political calculation behind this. Democrats did not take the Senate. They're hoping the runoff elections in Georgia might get them there. Right now, that's held to be unlikely. Senate Republicans will block any ambitious programs, any tax increases or Green New Deal type initiatives. And you know, why wouldn't they? The Democrats just spent 4 years resisting every presidential initiative tooth and nail, demonizing their opponents every step of the way. Why would Senate Republicans suddenly decide to embrace the spirit of bipartisanship just because the other side won, when the other side did exact opposite when it was their turn? Now, nobody expects them to do that. So it is in Joe Biden's interest to sell in advance to the American people that he is the voice of reason, reaching out in a bipartisan fashion. When you get gridlock, somebody will get the blame. Democrats are very close to control of both houses. Whether they advance across that line in the midterm elections or whether they get pushed further away depends on who gets the blame for the gridlock to come. And this shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone that you can't take Biden's words at face value. Trust gets built over time. You can't just claim it in victory. Now, you could argue back against that. You could anticipate the argument from the Democrats, which is, let's just agree that Trump was an aberration. If we can set the new normal now, then we can re-establish things the way they were before, with respect and decency and the basis for cross-party cooperation. The only problem is that that argument carries zero credibility because it's not actually how people behaved before Trump, and nor is it how Democrats are gearing up to behave right now. Everyone said how statesmanlike George W. Bush's statement congratulating Joe Biden has been. A fine example of how it should be done. And I personally agree. It was a good statement from the former president. That's not what they were saying about George W. Bush when he was president. They said many of the same things about him that they've said since about Trump. And they said the same about Mitt Romney when he was running against Obama. Indeed, it was Joe Biden himself who said that Mitt Romney would put blacks back in chains. And they expect, and I can't say I think that they're wrong, that whoever's the candidate next time, at some point, they will be saying that they will be even worse than Trump. Before the counting was even completed, Democrats were talking about drawing up a list of people complicit in the Trump administration. A website was launched, the Trump Accountability Project. Remember what they did. Does that sound like people looking to find ways for America to heal to you? Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez asked, is anyone archiving these Trump sycophants for when they try to downplay or deny their complicity in the future? I foresee decent probability of many deleted tweets, writings, photos in the future. Does that sound like people looking to find ways for America to heal for you? Of course not. Those criticising the Trump campaign for refusing to accept the legitimacy of the election might do well to consider that the other side spent the last 4 years doing the exact same thing. Here was Tom Tolles writing in the Washington Post in December 2016. There was something severely wrong with that election we just conducted, and not just the outcome. It's becoming pretty evident that Russia was actively intending and acting to subvert our principal exercise in democracy. 2.5 years after the election, Hillary Clinton was claiming that the election had been stolen from her. It turns out that a majority of Democrats believed the 2016 vote had not been free and fair. Guess what? A poll by Politico shows 70% of Republicans feel that way in 2020. 90% of Democrats had confidence in the vote, but it was only 52% before November the 3rd. The short version, people only believe it's free and fair when their side wins. The system is seen as open to abuse, so the losing side simply fills in the gaps each time, and it's unlikely they're correct, but it's not impossible. And that's the problem. Fix the integrity of your system so that your elections are beyond doubt. Now, unfortunately, when the media refuse to even show the president's team making their case, it provides what many will see as corroborating evidence that it's not just a few incidences of voter fraud, it's systemic bias. As it is, Trump came within a whisker of winning when the playing field was arguably significantly slanted against him. Trump is reportedly strongly considering a 2024 bid. Assuming he stays in good health and manages not to self-sabotage too grievously, and that last one's quite a big if, let's face it, I would put him as a favourite if he did, regardless of the slanted playing field. If Biden was successful in genuinely getting America to heal, that would become much less likely. I see no evidence that's about to happen. If it was, he would have to start by standing up to his own people, telling them to cut out the divisiveness, because you don't heal by lecturing your defeated opponents. All right, in just a moment, we'll get to the roundup of the week. But first, what's exercising the British mainstream media the most today is the news overnight that the Prime Minister's senior advisor, Dominic Cummings, the campaigner credited or blamed by many for Brexit, has said he will leave by the end of the year. Although he said that a long time ago, that was what he would do, it's confirmed now because his team has just lost out in some major power struggles of recent weeks around the Prime Minister's office. Cummings has been a hate figure for the media because they hated Brexit, and Cummings kind of felt the same way about them. He showed how a nimble campaign with a smart use of data can outsmart a massive political establishment, but he's also been the intellectual driving force leading an experiment at the heart of government. He'd been exploring for years via his blog questions about how you completely transform government to become more effective, and in the last year he's been given license to try to put some of it into practice. He's argued for a smarter approach to dealing with data, to leaner and more effective organisations, to more forward-looking and cost-effective defence procurement. And in many ways, the failures of the existing bureaucracy to deal with the pandemic logistical issues were a powerful argument for some sort of system reform. So while the mainstream are gloating and focusing on all the things they can find to trivialise and demonise him, as they will be doing, in the next video I'll be taking some time to look at what were the ideas he thought could transform how government works. Does this outcome mean that his attempt failed? And what does that mean now for the government, which some are saying will now be crafting itself as a gentler and a greener government? Love Dominic Cummings or hate him, he has been a hugely important change maker of the last few years. And there's a lot to unpick. So join me for that video, which will be launched here on Monday, 16th of November, 7 PM UK time. This week, the talk has been about the vaccine. The first glimmer that maybe all of the lockdown depression facing the country as winter hurtles towards us might at least have an end. Not yet, but quite soon. Actually, that's seen possible in any case, because it's turned out that while the government believed COVID-19 cases were on the rise when they brought in the second lockdown, in fact they were already levelling off and maybe beginning a gentle decline. Now, yesterday there was a jump. One result is likely to be just an anomaly, although some think it was the result of everyone having a last social blowout before the new lockdown came in. At least the vaccine will provide the conditions where politicians might start to be able to mentally adjust to the idea that we could return to normal. Now, this first vaccine is from Pfizer. It reportedly has an effectiveness of 90%, which is extremely high. And since governments have mostly been very clear that whatever the government's for or against lockdown might be, it is what they're going to do until the virus magically goes away or until a vaccine arrives. Well, we should be pleased that the time seems to be drawing closer. There's still the matter of whether governments will be able to roll it out at scale to the people that actually need it, in the face of the various forms of resistance that there will be. The UK government has said that it's ready for the challenge. But despite its promises to deliver all sorts of world-beating things, basic logistical execution has not been its strong point. So we may have to be a little patient. And not least because government seems to be a little distracted right now with its own internal power struggles, with the blow-ups between some of the politicos and the Vote Leave campaigners at the heart of government, as I mentioned vis-à-vis Dominic Cummings. Now, the fact that he seems imminently about to leave the White House didn't stop President Trump this week from removing the head of the organisation that produces the National Climate Assessment. Michael Cooperberg joined a number ejected from climate-related positions. He'd been expected to stay there until the fifth assessment was produced in 2023. This followed the demotion of Neil Chatterjee, head of the agency that regulates utility markets, after he made a comment in support of renewable power. I'm not a fan of scientists similar being removed from their jobs because the facts don't fit the agenda of those in charge. I don't know the detail on this one, so I'm not going to assume that's definitely what happened. But if it did, then it's an absurd thing to be done at this stage in the political cycle anyway. Now, let's be clear. I've been entirely consistent on this. I've stood up for climate skeptics when they've been removed from jobs because their opinions or their research didn't fit the mainstream narrative. I supported Susan Crockford, who had valid challenges to make about polar bear populations, and I've supported various others on this channel. If it's a principle whichever side is doing the firing and whichever side is calling foul. Unfortunately, I don't see any of the climate skeptics who cried foul when it was one of their own speaking up about this instance. One or two have commented on it approvingly. No apparent disapproval anywhere to be found. Now, at least some of the climate scientists did a better job this week. A number of them came out very strongly against stories that started appearing based on a particularly apocalyptic paper that appeared in the journal Scientific Reports. Even if we cut emissions right now, it's still too late. That was the spirit of the headlines anyway. Climate scientists such as Richard Betts and many others all pitched in to point out this paper was based on an extremely crude model that was not intended even by its authors to be taken as evidence of the sort the headlines were making out. The criticism led the Journal to issue a revised press release rowing back on its original statements. Too late, of course. Various papers have already run with headlines that the extreme doomerists are then quoting all over Twitter and adding to the unhappy noise. But I do draw one thing from this. All those genuine conspiracy theorists like Tony Heller, that they're always suggesting that scientists are pushing the narrative of imminent doom, well, I never seem to notice nor explain the numerous scientists who push back when people like Extinction Rebellion, or in this case the radical outliers, paint a picture of gloomy doomerism that is not supported by the science. That's not really consistent with the idea that they're all faking the figures in order to push the narrative. But then, as we've already established, few people are much interested in consistency. Some of the scientists, those that have not morphed into activists in their own right, but certainly none of the campaigners. And speaking of the more extreme doomerist campaigners, in this week in the UK we had Remembrance Day. The Queen and others still at the cenotaph to honour the fallen heroes of the wars, our annual commemoration of those who made the ultimate sacrifice to give us the freedoms that we have today. Not everybody saw this as much of a thing, unfortunately. Yes, Extinction Rebellion decided to hijack the solemnity of the commemoration by doing their own thing. A big message carried over all the poppy wreaths laid to remember the dead, and a big banner to show that there is no gesture too crass for someone who thinks it's a good idea to slap an XR logo on it. Unsurprisingly, this provoked an absolute outpouring of outrage, numerous press articles, an absolute stream on social media. Whoever would have predicted that might go badly? In the old days, the group at least seemed to have some sort of functioning strategic brain that could recognise when it messed up, and they just seem to have stopped caring. No recognition they got it wrong, they just complain about all the upset people. How many feel about yesterday has been entirely determined by the framing of certain media outlets who have painted this as something it was not. Well, no, people were furious about this the moment it became public. The media outlets just jumped on that wave of fury. You have to be a long way inside your own ideological bubble not to see that hijacking Remembrance Day is going to go badly. Honestly, I study campaigns and how they achieve change. I have no idea what strategy this group even thinks they're following anymore. Apart from damaging their own cause and chasing after headlines opportunistically whenever anyone's got a half-brained idea, I just have no concept what they're for. If you know, let us know in the comments below. Now, in a moment, we'll look at a couple of comments and questions from recent videos and finish off with the final thought of the week. But first, you probably heard the phrase, the Great Reset. You've certainly heard the phrase, building back better. A number of different agencies have been arguing that things need to change with how the world organises itself, and the disruption caused by COVID-19 might just be the catalyst to make it happen. One of those is the World Economic Forum, and its founder Klaus Schwab wrote a book outlining his thinking. Time magazine featured the discussion. Various businesses have put out commentary on the topic. But not everybody thinks this is just a debate about what should happen next, originating from one of the most famous talking shops in the world. Breitbart writer James Delingpole described it as one of the most terrifying and dangerous globally coordinated assaults on liberty and prosperity in the history of mankind. If the plan succeeds, the world you inhabit will be unrecognisable. Your children will have no prospects and your life will barely be worth living. Build back better means totalitarian rule by a global technocratic elite, as constrictive and immiserating as life under fascism or communism.
Oh my God!
Is he right? Or was this just a bit of high rhetoric in advance of the US election? He's not alone. World Economic Forum videos on YouTube are routinely downvoted heavily by people who are convinced that there's a conspiracy. Even if there isn't, what are Klaus Schwab's ideas? Who shares them, and are they good or bad for the future of our society? This is what I shall be dipping into on Wednesday the 18th of November next week at 7 PM UK time. One way or another, it's an important conversation. Join me then to talk about the Great Reset. I had one comment on last week's video about the opposition to some lockdowns. You have a huge spike in cases and deaths are starting to spike at hundreds per day, yet people don't want a lockdown. I don't get it. Well, the question is this, and it's a serious one. Is hundreds a day a lot? How do you know? We know that when we focus on something, it grows in importance and significance. We as a society have been obsessing about this. Daily death counts in all the headlines, all the stories of those that have suffered and so on. Of course, many thousands of people die every day. So the question isn't how many people, but how far are we from normal? On the one hand, right now, even with the increase, for most European countries, COVID deaths are in line now with the seasonal respiratory deaths that happen each year. Since countries have different processes for attributing COVID deaths, it pays to look at the overall excess deaths for all causes, because if you've got lots of deaths that are being misattributed, you'd still see the aggregate number increase. That's exactly what we saw for the first spike back in March. Apparently that's not what we're seeing right now. And it's that sort of evidence for the people who see enormous damage from the lockdowns. They look at that and then they question whether the cure might not be worse than the disease. That's not to say that there aren't strong arguments on the other side, because we know this disease is highly infectious, and the nature of exponential growth can mean that you get swamped very quickly if it did spread to the peak of its potential. Which is why most authorities are convinced they can't afford to wait and see. Because by the time you know you bet the wrong way, you're in the deepest water and sinking fast. I have sympathy for both, but the out-of-hand dismissal of sceptic arguments aren't how we should go about making this decision-making process. The government is getting estimates of deaths that would happen from doing nothing, and those seem a bit overblown, but no estimates of harm from lockdowns. Now, a question on the recent hate crime video. Mallen, would you consider hate speech to be a political tool? For protected classes it is meant to protect all seem to be communities that the left tries to claim representation for and targets concepts and language conservatives are likely to use. Islamophobia is a commonly evoked term, but I couldn't even tell you what the word for anti-Christian sentiment is, as is the case for racism against white people, which is rampant on Twitter and among some politicians. Is it necessarily a political tool? No, but it's hard to define. Is it currently a political tool? Significantly, yes. The argument that racism only works one way is a pernicious one, because it's justification for why the right kind of racism is good and progressive. I generally do hold that if a statement looks vile when you change the identity of the group that it's about, then it's vile, full stop. All the arguments about punching up and punching down are just so much justificationary confetti. Generally, these constructs are being used as a tool to exert power over others. And you know, that's what people do. It's fine. But it shouldn't be confused with universal principles such as judging people by the content of their character, not the colour of their skin. And that actually neatly segues into this episode's closing thought. Until this week, Greg Clark was the Football Association chairman. Giving evidence to a parliamentary select committee, he was sympathetically discussing the problems that black players still face in the game. In so doing, he used the phrase high-profile coloured footballers. That was a term that was widely used in past decades, but which the black community now intensely and understandably dislikes. It was pointed out to him this was an outdated term. He immediately apologised, explaining, "I sometimes trip over my words." He pointed out he'd spent some time in the US where the phrase people of colour is widely used. Indeed, one of the foremost equal opportunities organisations there is the National Association of Coloured People. There's been some debate about whether they should change their name, but they haven't done so yet. So if you don't follow these things closely, because let's face it, not every human being has got the time, why would you know that person of colour is super woke and coloured person is disgusting and career ending? I mean, you might know it now because very publicly a high profile figure wandered into the rat trap and he's now out of a job. But those goalposts constantly move, so you're never going to be sure about the rules. The news coverage said that Clark used the disgraceful term coloured people for BAME people, which is black, Asian and minority ethnic people. But recently certain campaigners said that BAME was now outdated and offensive. UK Music said it was a careless catch-all acronym and offensive. Now, it's one thing if the language of race is constantly evolving. People are trying to get to grips with something that people hold to be important, and the old language had values-laden connotations that we do and should want to leave behind. But when you're in that position, the idea that using the wrong term is to be a career-ending mistake and one that gets you condemned as being self-evidently a deficient person is one that is profoundly stupid and unjust. They all lined up to condemn him. The sports minister, former sportsman, they said things like absolutely abhorrent, deep offence and completely unacceptable and awful, just awful. They are the problem, not Clark. Using the wrong word is not the problem, so much as being so constantly and easily offended is the problem. And having institutions collude with that attitude so nobody can afford to go against the narrative. It creates and feeds the atmosphere of dread, where everyone fears saying anything at all in case they say the wrong thing. It creates the sort of moral judgmentalism that used to see women burned at the stake, which in saner times we kind of concluded was a bad thing, didn't we? Alright, last week the video on hate crime was too much for the YouTube algorithm, and it got demonetised for fear that it might be, hateful, I suppose. It got restored on appeal, but not until 3 days after launch, by which time it had had most of its traffic. As I've said before, this happens a lot, and it's the consequence of talking about issues that people find interesting and controversial. And that's why it's so important that people support this channel as patrons. The support of the generous and fantastic people who are already signed up makes it possible to do these videos and to go for whatever issues are important to discuss, not just the easy things. If you value the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content I aim to produce on this channel, please consider adding your support by going to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. That support is always appreciated. I wouldn't be able to even consider increasing the content to 3 or more videos per week without it. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is The Mallen Baker Show.